Welcome everyone to the first of what I hope to be an ongoing series of webinars with internationally renowned female experts. Today's panel truly exemplifies the superb intellect and policy proficiency of 21st century women who have all dedicated their lives to not just the betterment of our society as a whole, but to our survival as Jews in a world in which we're surrounded by haters. Phyllis, Sarah, and Shoshana are three women who are brilliant, prolific, accomplished, and insightful, and I thank each of them for agreeing to participate in this webinar. I'm not going to spend the time to read their vast biographies. Those were attached to the invite, and as impressive as they are, they still do not do these women and their accomplishments justice. I was considering referring you all to their recent articles, but quite honestly, everything they write is worth the time to read. So I encourage you to visit Emmet's website at www.emmetonline.org and JPC's website at www.jewishpolicycenter.org, and to sign up for their newsletters, and to visit Dr. Chesler's website at www.phyllis-chesler.com and follow her incredible volume of articles, books, essays, and videos. I know that some organizations host webinars with a deep dive on one particular issue, but given the number of both domestic and foreign policy issues that have arisen since the outbreak of this Wuhan virus pandemic, and yes, it did originate in China, and we can say that, I wanted to touch on many different issues given the depth of knowledge of our panelists. So I'm going to spend the first part of the webinar posing questions to the panelists on a litany of diverse topics, after which I'll present them with questions from you all. Please feel free to email me at lregan@emmetonline.org with any questions you may have, or you can use the prompt on your Zoom screen to send me a question as well. I can't promise that we're going to get to all of the questions given the time constraints, but if we're unable to get to your question today, we can perhaps revisit them in a future webinar, or you can follow up with me online and we can get you some responses. The first question, Shoshana, I wanted to talk to you about China, which for almost 20 years by various U.S. administrations, the EU and private industry with manufacturing, everything from medical supply to 5G technology. It's been stealing our U.S. intellectual property, manipulating the U.S. dollar, and continually exposing the world to fatal pathogens while outright lying about them and blaming this on the U.S. And that doesn't even touch on their human rights violations and military aggression. Can you discuss China's place in the international community, how you see this virus impacting its ability to continue to work with foreign powers, the impact it will have on China's economy and therefore the world at large, and any other military implications you see as being significant?
So I get an easy question to start with. The decline and fall of China. Look, the Chinese economy was in trouble before the Wuhan virus. And despite China's best efforts, a lot of countries in the West and elsewhere are beginning to see that China is a problem. Despite its best efforts to paint itself as a good guy, the UK imported Chinese coronavirus tests and discovered that they were faulty after they'd paid for them. Spain, Italy, Slovakia, the Czech Republic all had the same experience. And last week, Canada rejected 1 million N95 masks, the professional hospital masks that they got from China because they were defective. So the Chinese, as, I don't know, not very careful about what they do. I'm not suggesting they did it on purpose, but what they have sent for testing and masks have been very, very faulty. In addition, they're facing new problems. Japan is spending billions of government dollars to bring Chinese businesses back out, Japanese businesses back out of China. And Australia is having a nervous breakdown with an economic embargo because the Australians want to investigate how the COVID-19 pandemic happened to them, the up and the down. As it happens, China bought gargantuan amounts of hospital equipment, medicines, and actual hospitals in Australia in December and January, and they spent January and February closing those hospitals. The Australians, needless to say, are very angry. The Chinese are threatening them. Now, what that means is China is likely to see its economy decline in a big way. The implication for the United States is twofold. First of all, buy the things it is expected to buy under the US-China Free Trade Deal, Part 1, that was negotiated by the administration. If they can't buy the stuff, the tariffs come back. If the tariffs come back, the Chinese don't have the money to pay the tariffs. It will increase the speed with which US businesses leave China. That's the good news. The bad news is the Chinese are going to have to figure out how to get money. And most likely they will turn to the Belt and Road Initiative, which is their initiative with the countries of Central Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. The Chinese lent enormous amounts of money to those countries, buying hard assets, mines, ports, and other kinds of things that they really do want. And now that the African countries and the Central Asian countries cannot pay their loans back to China, China's going to foreclose. And they're either going to try to wrest money out of the treasury, or they're going to end up owning a lot of mines and ports and other strategic assets all across Central Asia and Africa. That is not good for us. And I'm not sure what we do about it, but some of those are our trading partners. Israel is not a member of the Belt and Road Initiative, despite the fact that it lives in the Middle East. But China has deep economic, trade, and social ties with China and Chinese institutions. Most specifically, China is slated to take over the port of Haifa in 2021 and run it for Israel. Haifa is where the US Navy docks when it's in the Middle East. The US Navy and the US government are not happy about this. I don't know what the Israelis are going to do about it at this point. They had been saying, well, it's okay, we'll manage the Chinese, we'll manage how the ports work. At this point, I am not clear how the Israelis are going to manage their security relations with China without continuing to aggravate the United States. From the United States security point of view, Israel then is less of an asset than it used to be. And I would say of the United States out there in the Western Pacific, you know, the aircraft carrier USS Theodore Roosevelt was pulled out of the Western Pacific owing to coronavirus. It's now in Guam. If I were the Chinese, I could not think of a better thing to do than figure out how to get the United States to take its aircraft carrier, its preeminent source of prestige, power, and military might in the Western Pacific, and move it away than coronavirus has been. The US is going to have to rethink this. And because I believe in stopping on a positive note, I'm going to say one positive thing about what's happening here, and that is that Mexican cartels are having trouble getting Chinese synthetic drugs. And it is from Chinese synthetic drugs that they make things like fentanyl, which they illegally import to the United States, causing havoc in the United States. So the only good piece of news I see here is that the Mexican cartels are pretty much out of business on redistributing Chinese fentanyl. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Shoshana. You covered a lot in a very short period of time, and I'm sure we'll have some follow-up questions on that. I'm going to move on, Phyllis, to you. You've spent the better part of the last few decades writing about and fighting the rise of global anti-Semitism. In particular, your 2003 book, The New Anti-Semitism, was the first to really recognize what turned out to be an unbelievably prescient thesis, which is that the anti-Zionism taking hold across the globe was just a cover for what in reality is actually good old-fashioned anti-Semitism. You also recognize that anti-Israel propaganda does not die an easy death, but rather takes hold and infects people the world over in ways similar to a pandemic. Can you discuss some of the blood libels that have impacted the world's Jewish community, including discussing how they so easily spread? Phyllis,
yes,
I believe you're on mute.
Yes, yeah. Two of my recent articles looked into this, and when the Muhammad al-Dura blood libel happened in the year 2000, it was like yesterday. This is the accusation that the Israelis purposely killed a Palestinian child crouching behind his father. Of course, this did not happen. It may have been staged, but one way or the other, the Israelis at Netzarim Junction could not have done it. Well, that was then. And since then, there has been brilliant persistence in rebutting this. Physicist Nachum Shahaf, who looked at the ballistics trajectory. We have Esther Shapiro, who did a film. We have Philippe Carcenti, who was sued 2 or 3 times by Raja Andalan of France's Channel 2. You would think, well, that's been put to rest. we now know the truth. Wrong. I went just 10 days ago to Google, which led me immediately to Wikipedia, and the top story is the narrative according to France's Channel 2, which said that they were in possession of such a graphic tape that they couldn't show it. It was too horrible, right? Of course, at the end of the day, there was no such tape. And this, if you're a high school student or a college student or a graduate student, and you are lazy and not expert and trust anything that's not peer mediated on the internet, you'll go to Google, which will lead you to Wikipedia, where you will find that after after many pages, or even in the lead articles, they will at the bottom then tell us all about the rebuttals. They call this the controversy. So I don't know how, and the same is true, by the way, for another blood libel, 2002, the so-called massacre in Jenin by the Israelis, which Yvonne Ridley, a lunatic who I've debated, and I say that as a clinical psychologist, she said this was the greatest human rights atrocity in the history of the world. What really happened is because of public opinion, international pressure, Israel was forced to send in 23 young Israeli soldiers, may they rest in peace. 23 had to go house to house on foot. Everything was booby-trapped. There were grenades. There were snipers shooting at them from mosques and from ambulances, which, according to IDF protocol, you can't attack, and they didn't. They behaved so carefully, for which, as usual, Israel was tarred, feathered, smeared. Now, how do we get rid of or take on the United Nations or the international human rights organizations or the professoriate and the glitterati, where a good deal of this propaganda plus the Islamic world propaganda have joined forces? Similarly, I ask us, how do we take on Google and Wikipedia? How do we, I also did one more thing. I looked for Palestinian terrorism. I wanted to see how Google, Wikipedia would tell me about it. They immediately sent me to a text about political violence, which is undertaken in order to achieve sovereignty against colonial oppression, right? So the lack of context, the lack of understanding on the internet that Islam is probably historically and today the largest practitioner of both gender and religious apartheid, not Israel, and has a history of imperialism and colonialism and conversion via the sword and a hand in the filthy African slave trade and anti-Black slavery and prejudice today. If I tried to tell this to my people, my former people, leftists, feminists, they would not know anything about this. So again, I ask us, how do we get the facts out? How do we get indoctrinated people to believe the truth when Orwell reigns?
Thank you for that insightful background on the really critical issue, Phyllis. I'm going to move on to Sarah and follow up with that to where we are today in where we're seeing raging anti-Semitism during COVID-19. And it's extremely dangerous, I think, to the well-being of Jews across the world. Israel's being accused, as always, of all sorts of human rights abuses, but the accusations now go to Israel causing the Wuhan virus, withholding treatment and much needed medical supplies in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And the lies keep coming. Sarah, can you elaborate on what you see playing out and ways in which maybe we can address these lies and distortions?
Sure. Ever since the Black Plague of 1342, whenever there are times of uncertainty and insecurity, people want someone to scapegoat. And unfortunately, the time-proven scapegoat has always been the Jews, either the Jews as individuals or the Jews as collective, the state of Israel. About 2 weeks ago in Columbus, Ohio, there was an anti-quarantine rally, and several signs displayed a rat with the Star of David superimposed on the flag of the State of Israel. The real plague, they said, was the State of Israel. And of course, on the left, we can always count on people like Linda Sarsour, former chairperson of the Women's March, or co-chair, who said in a Zoom webinar last week that COVID-19, quote, is a death sentence for over 2 million people, and that blood will be on the hands of the American people and Israel. And despite the fact that we all know Israeli health officials have been working closely with Palestinian health officials in both Gaza and in the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, if you will, Ben Norton, a left-wing prolific writer, said that Israel has bombed to pieces Gaza's health infrastructure. And he recently tweeted, "Every Palestinian death caused by COVID-19 is on the blood of Israel's hands." Awful. And of course, we have Jewish American activists, such as writer Marie Zansen, who said that Jewish Israelis will now get a taste of what around the same number of Palestinians living under occupation have experienced for over half a century. Former Human Rights Watch official Sarah Whitson just said, "Such a tiny taste for Israel. Missing is a tablespoon of blood," drawing on the classic, blood type of canard. And of course, the most visible figure of the BDS machine is Omar Barghouti, who said in a Zoom webinar recently that Palestinians should continue with their struggle, COVID-19 virus or not. And he also said, interestingly, that if a vaccine should happen to come out of Israel, they could take it. It's worth noting that Barghouti is a graduate of Tel Aviv University, which calls to boycott within the framework of the academic boycott of Israel. Okay, and of course, throughout the globe, in Iran, they were very quick to blame both America and Israel. And on March 5th, on Iranian Press TV, an academic source said that Zionists were the driving force behind the coronavirus, and that they had developed a deadlier strain, particularly against Iran. In Turkey, of course, under the rule of Erdogan, they have unfortunately descended to the dark side. On a pro-Erdogan television show, an expert said, "Whoever spreads the virus will find the cure." Israel had already made a statement that they have found a vaccine. They're working on them. They found the vaccination. So whoever is the source of the vaccine, they are the accomplice in spreading this virus. So we see the same old disgusting stereotypes and canards as we do going all the way back to the Black Death of 1342. It's very sad.
And scary. Thank you very much, Sarah. Shoshana, I'm going to go back to you with another foreign policy question. Iran has been hit pretty hard by COVID-19, while at the same time experiencing the impact of the Trump administration's quote unquote maximum pressure campaign, which is meant to squeeze the Iranian economy enough to bring the regime back to the negotiating table. How has the combination of the pandemic and the sanctions impacted the Iranian economy and its foreign policy more generally vis-a-vis the US and Israel? Do you believe they are more or less dangerous pre-COVID-19 versus their aggressive stance these days?
We tend to think that COVID-19 or the Wuhan virus or the Chinese Communist government virus changes everything. It doesn't really change certain things. Iran was a wreck before, and it's a wreck now. The restoration of sanctions, catalyst for a lot of things, but things are just moving along a continuum. They were not changed either its foreign or domestic chief policy goals. And the first of those is undermining the Sunni states in the Middle East and in Africa, undermining Israel, and wreaking havoc for the United States with its friends in various places and in the Persian Gulf. It's a reminder, actually, if you need a reminder, that the mullahs are not Iranian nationalists. Some of them are not actually Iranian people. They are Shiite supremacists, and their goal is to pass Shiism along in places whether they want it or not. So look at where Iran spends its money, sanctions or no sanctions. They've spent $15 billion in Syria. They're spending $700 to $800 million annually on Hezbollah. They spend $150 million annually on the militias of Iraq. We've stopped looking at Iraq, but the Iranians haven't stopped looking at it. And they spend about $100 million a year on Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza. So what is that? What happens to them then when the Wuhan virus shows up? Doctors Without Borders tried to come into Iran, and the Iranians kept them out. They turned them away because Doctors Without Borders comes with medical supplies, with doctors, with equipment, and the Iranians didn't want that. They wanted cash money. The United States also made a very generous offer to Iran about medical supplies, medical personnel, and equipment. And they turned that down as well because they want money. And the reason they want money is because they're not interested in medical supplies and doctors. They're interested in money for their military programs. So what are they doing? They still want to control the Shiite Crescent, the kind of area north of Iran and across the Mediterranean Sea, and the part of Saudi Arabia to the south, and make a base in Yemen, which would give them control of the Red Sea. All of those things were their goals before. They are their goals now. What has happened is they begin to feel themselves today more stressed, more pressured. When that happens to a country, you have to watch out for overt aggression. And last weekend, the Iranians confronted some American Navy ships in the Persian Gulf. They were not serious about shooting at our ships. The military experts will tell you that they came in a way that was, I'm coming, but I'm not shooting. They also had a mullah on the ship, and they showed the mullah's picture all over Iran on the nightly news. You don't put a mullah on your boat if you're going to go to war. So the idea was to show their own people that they still have military capability. They are still standing up to the great Satan. They are still looking out for the interests as they proclaim the interests to be, but they're trying hard not to go so far as to have us shoot back at them. Generally speaking, we're not going to shoot back at them. But, and I don't have anything positive to end this thought with, a mistake by an overly aggressive Iranian or a mistake by an overly aggressive American could create a conflagration with devastating consequences in the region. So Iran is on its path, and we had better hope that cool heads prevail on both sides.
Okay, thank you.
I'm not sure you're really thanking me, but
no,
okay.
I'm always thanking you, Shoshana, for your insights, as scary as they may be. In a recent article, Sarah, you wrote about an incident on Israel's border with Lebanon in which Hezbollah penetrated northern Israel, while bragging that while some of their terror tunnels may have been shut down, they are still able to cross over into Israeli territory. For the past couple of years, Israel has been walking a fine line between containing military aggression of Iranian proxies in Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, while not initiating a full-blown war with Hezbollah or Iran itself, which I'm glad this question is following on the heels of Shoshana's last comment. I know this is a complicated subject, but can you talk briefly about what's happening in Lebanon, Sarah, and what the US and Israel are facing in terms of a nation now basically run by an Iranian proxy terrorist regime, and US policy with regards to the arming of the Lebanese armed forces, which I know is something you've been working on.
Right. This is a very, very complicated issue. Lebanon is a mosaic of different cultures, but unfortunately, in the South in particular, the Lebanese armed forces has been totally overrun by Hezbollah. In fact, we have had many, many conference calls with many Israeli scholars and experts, including Ephraim Inbar, who said, basically, the Lebanese armed forces and Hezbollah are indistinguishable. We, the American government, gives about $1.84 billion a year, $1 million, I'm sorry, to the LAF. And over the past 10 years, we've given about $1.82 billion and $224 billion a year. But we have seen, and a lovely young man who works for Amet, Benjamin Whale, who was a commander in the IDF, and he served on the border with Lebanon, has seen, and there are pictures of the LAF members giving uniforms to Hezbollah. Lebanese armed forces members refuse actually to go into certain villages unless they are accompanied by Hezbollah. This is so pernicious for America and for Israel, and we see now that there are 130 to 150,000 missiles staring down at Israel from southern Lebanon. So it makes things much, much more difficult. We know also that they are converting their dummy missiles into smart missiles with GPSs so they can aim directly at Tel Aviv or at any of the infrastructures of Israel. And we see that the hearts and minds of many, many of the people are being taken over by Hezbollah. The name of a very, very popular scouting club is called the Al-Mahdi Cub Scouts or Scouts, and these kids are dressed up in LAF uniforms. Kids as old as 4 are dressed up in LAF uniforms. They're given rifles, and they're sent down to the border of Israel. About 2 months ago now, myself and Benjamin Wheel met with Ambassador Ron Dermer, and he said to us, you can go into any house in southern Lebanon, and they will say to you, this is my kitchen, this is my bedroom, this is my rocket room. Hezbollah has taken over most of the homes in southern Lebanon, and we have a huge, huge problem. I think it's time for us to really question this money that we have been giving automatically to the LAF. The reason that we gave this money was after the 2006 war in Lebanon, and it was supposed to act as a bulwark against Hezbollah. But unfortunately now there's such a cozy relationship between Lebanon and the LAF and Hezbollah that it is almost impossible to distinguish where the margins of the LAF end and where Hezbollah begins.
Thank you, Sarah. So we're going to move away from foreign policy issues for a moment, and I'm going to turn to you, Phyllis. Phyllis has spent her life as a feminist leader fighting on the front lines of women's rights across the globe, which is, I helped define who you are and your moral grounding, and I think that makes you the perfect person to discuss feminist issues in the age of the Me Too movement. And in particular, Phyllis, we lived through the Senate confirmation battle over Brett Kavanaugh's Supreme Court nomination that I would consider a low point in the country's history. On the relatively close heels of that ugliness, we're now learning of sexual harassment allegations against the presumptive Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden by his former staffer Tara Reade, who we have recently learned has credible and numerous witnesses to substantiate her allegations. Given that in the 19 days after the Kavanaugh accusations first appeared, CNN had 700 stories about it, while it took CNN weeks to first publish a report on the Biden accusations just a few days ago. What are your thoughts on the state of the Me Too movement and the treatment afforded to both accusers and accused in these two cases?
An important question. Just as Israel has been so falsely defamed, I have to say women have similarly been defamed, viewed as crazy, unstable, childlike, hysterical, and vengeful, and we have not been believed when we allege real rape, real sexual harassment. So that's the context, the background for this. And had the original work of the late 1960s and early 1970s where we had speak outs on rape and on sexual harassment and on woman beating, had that become part of the university, then we might have had Me Too movements all along the way. We wouldn't have had to wait for an internet age. In any event, I have discovered, and I've written about it in A Politically Incorrect Feminist, a recent book of mine, that feminists play politics, well, like everyone else. So the principle of believe the woman, it depends on who the man is. If the man is really famous and a headline name, get him. Even if there's no jury, no judge, no evidence, no proof. The allegations, especially if made by many, he's out of his job, his reputation is gone. And the allegation may be true, but often innocent men, I know of a few that I've interviewed, have been ruined by false allegations, by crazy allegations. So I think Kavanaugh, I agree with you, that was a Star Chamber hearing. That was crazy. And just as feminists chose to believe Anita Hill because she was accusing a conservative man of wrongdoing, the same group of feminists would not go on the hunt for Bill Clinton, who had accusations of rape and ethical lapses that have haunted poor Monica Lewinsky ever since. It has shaped, shadowed, ruined, or reduced her life to this single issue. We have women who also collaborate with perpetrators. Just think of Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein, but this is what exists as part of the patriarchal structure. Now, it is not surprising, but it is disgusting that, and I looked at the articles as you have, Lauri. Christine Blasey Ford, she didn't have any witnesses. She doesn't remember where it took place. She can't even remember exactly when this alleged episode took place. At the time, Kavanaugh was 17 years old. If you hung me out now to dry for things I did when I was 17, it would be really ridiculous, right? She didn't tell anyone at the time. Well, she was also very young. She didn't have a job that she was fired from, did she? And there were no witnesses then and no witnesses now. And her allegation amounts to Kavanaugh and a friend, drunken, pushed her down on a bed, and that's where it ended. Nevertheless, she was believed everywhere. There were headlines every day. That's even before the hearing. In every newspaper, this was covered. Why? Because the Democratic Party and the feminist movement, what's left of it that hasn't been totally Palestinianized, although most of it has been, they didn't want somebody who may be against abortion on the bench, despite his lovely, wonderful record of hiring so many women to clerk for him. He was seen as obviously anti-abortion based on I'm not sure what. Now, let's look at Tara Reid in comparison, and we know that her story has been disappeared and minimized, and nobody as yet has challenged Biden. In fact, it's like Joe, he's handsy, but you know, a guy will be a guy, boys will be boys, nothing to look at here. So she, at the time, told her family, told a neighbor, she told her immediate supervisor in the Senate, and she was therefore demoted to a small room with no window, and then she was fired. This alone is proof that she was treated as a whistleblower, because that's how whistleblowers are handled. She says now that she was too embarrassed to talk about penetration, digital penetration, which is why she didn't mention it. She mentioned only sexual harassment ongoing. And it turns out that her mother at the time seemed to have called into Larry King and asked a question. Her mother is now dead, but it's her mother's voice, she says, asking what should a staffer do if she doesn't want to go to the media because she respects the senator and the Senate and thought she'd have a future there, that's over. What can such a staffer do? And yet, the mass media has disappeared this. Now, it's not hard to figure out why. It's very simple. I mean, Biden, who is senile, and God knows who his VP choice will be. I can only shudder to think. But I thought that we fought a revolution, not so that he would have to choose a woman and a woman of color. I thought it would be the very, very best person possible for the job, but what do I know? So the Me Too movement was hijacked by Islamists, by Nation of Islam maniacs who've never done a single thing for women or for women's rights, and they made a fortune out of it. They were put on the covers of magazines. It's quite an important and very, very American story. So that's what I have to say. I would like men who are the heads of factories, small offices, who run agricultural workers to also be charged if guilty. I would like them to be brought to trial. But of course, if you're a woman working in the lettuce field, your boss will say to you, if you tell anybody, I'll get custody of your kids and I'll kill you. And we have not begun to go to that level.
Thank you, Phyllis. We're going to turn back to foreign policy, Shoshana, and I wanted to ask you to spend some time talking about the relationship of Israel, the Palestinians, and their neighbors in today's Middle East. And I know that's a broad question, but given the pro-Israel policies of the Trump administration, US and Israel relations with the Sunni Arab states, and the COVID-19 virus, what can you share with us about the peace process and the viability of a Palestinian state living side by side in peace with Israeli neighbors? Which, I mean, I'm sure that your answer would not be any different pre-COVID-19 than post-COVID-19. That hasn't changed the prospects, but I know that our listeners would definitely like to hear you discuss the peace process. And then perhaps you can also touch on the issue that was raised in your last column and that we're reading about in the news regarding the expanding of Israeli sovereignty over Judea and Samaria.
Another small question. Thank you, Lauri. The pandemic seems to have done nothing as much as it has sped up trends that were already operating in the region. Everything that I said about Iran worries Israel, but everything I said about Iran worries Saudi Arabia even more, and therefore worries the Gulf states even more. They're closer. The Iranians don't need long-range rockets to hit Saudi Arabia or Bahrain. And on top of which, the Russia-Saudi oil price war has collapsed oil prices, meaning that the Saudis have less to work with. The Iranians have less to work with, yes, which is a good thing, but the Saudis and the Bahrainis and the Omanis and people that had begun moving toward Israel also have less to work with and less with which to oppose Iran. They don't see anything good happening in the region, the Saudis and the Gulfies, except Israel. So I suspect that the trend toward acceptance of Israel by the Gulf states will be sped up. At the same time, Israel has to manage its borders. And Sarah talked about Hezbollah and the Lebanese border, but there's also the question of Syria. Things have been exploding in Syria with some regularity. Israel does not take credit for those things, responsibility for those things, blame for those things. But it has to be said, the things that are blowing up inside of Syria are things that Israel has said they will not tolerate close to their borders. So Israel, even as it does the pandemic, even as it does the lockdown, still has to keep an eye on Hezbollah, still has to keep an eye on what's happening in Syria. On the other side, the Eastern Mediterranean Energy Consortium, which is Israel, Cyprus, Greece, Egypt, Jordan, and the Palestinian Authority, is still operating. They're all working to bring natural gas to the marketplace, which is great for helping Israel's legitimacy in the region. However, the collapse of industry and the potential worldwide recession that will come from the pandemic will make it harder for them to sell their natural gas, just as it's harder for oil producers to sell oil. Someone said recently his car gets 3 weeks to the gallon, right? Think about that. People are not buying gasoline. They're not running factories. They don't need natural gas. So the consortium hangs together, but it's not terribly productive. When you get to the Palestinians, you notice I left the Palestinians for last. And the reason for that is nobody wants to talk about them anymore. not only do they seem to have blown their last chance, even, I will tell you, there was a story in Sputnik Russia, which is actually a good source on Middle East news, quoting a man in the Saudi government saying that Mohammed bin Salman thinks the Palestinians have wasted too many opportunities thrown their way. When coronavirus is behind us, Mohammed bin Salman plans on telling the Palestinians, either take the peace plan or leave it, but if you leave it, don't come back. So the Palestinians have lost a lot of their footing. At the same time, Palestinian doctors and nurses in Judea and Samaria have been in the front of telling people that they work with their Israeli counterparts, that they get medicine from the Israelis. Not in Gaza, it's not in the same Gaza, but Palestinian doctors and nurses have broken the taboo on saying nice things about the Israeli system. On the other hand, because there's always another hand, the Palestinian Authority propaganda machine is still spewing what it spews. The Europeans, although they want to cooperate with Israel on coronavirus and vaccines, are still trying to pass resolutions condemning Israel. And I'll give you your positive note right here. They did a poll at Tel Aviv University for the Jewish People Policy Institute, and I have to read this. The number of non-Jewish people in Israel who define themselves primarily as Palestinian now stands at 7%, down from 18% a year ago. 51% self-identify as Israeli Arabs, while 23% define themselves primarily as Israeli. We're talking non-Jewish Israelis. 23% define themselves primarily as Israeli, which is a sizable increase from 5% last year. Asked how much they feel, quote, like real Israelis, 65% of the Arabs said they agree completely, 33% said they agree somewhat. Trends that had been working before coronavirus have been enhanced. There are negative trends that are enhanced. There are also positive trends that are enhanced. And to go to your last question about sovereignty, there's a big, what I think that people should keep in mind as they go forward is annexation is not the same as applying sovereignty. Be careful about it, because the word annexation means to take for one's country, territory, or a country that belongs to someone else. That's what annexation is. That is not what Israel is doing in Judea and Samaria. The last legitimate ruler of that territory was the British, under the British mandate. Prior to that, it was the Ottoman Empire. Prior to that, you can go all the way back to the Jews. All of the occupiers, till you get back to the Jews. They're never, the Jordanian grab of Judea and Samaria was in fact an annexation. They were not entitled to that territory by the definition, and it was called illegal by most of the world. So when Israel talks about applying sovereignty, they're not talking about taking someone else's land, someone else's country, someone else's whatever. They are applying sovereignty in an area that did not have legitimate sovereignty before, since the British. And if you want to try to give it to the British, you try to give it back to the British. I suspect they will not take it. So words matter. These words in particular matter. And it's nice to see an American administration that agrees with Israel that we're not talking about annexation, we're talking about the application of sovereignty.
Thank you, Shoshana. Very important point, and I appreciate you making that. Sarah, we have just to let the audience know that we're going to ask Sarah one more question and Phyllis one more question before we open it up to some of the questions you are sending in. Sarah, can you share with us what's going on in Washington, and in particular how legislation is or is not moving forward on the Hill? I know you work tirelessly under normal circumstances, pounding the floors of Congress to meet with staffers and various representatives on legislative initiatives of concern to Emmett. But every time I talk to you, I know you're busier than ever, and it's amazing to me how much you are actually accomplishing in the midst of this global pandemic. So can you share with us what initiatives you see moving forward that are of concern on a U.S. national security, Israeli national security basis, and how that's working?
Right. Before I begin, I want to compliment, first of all, all of my fellow panelists, but and Phyllis, I read about you when I was an undergraduate at Barnard, and then that was before, in the good old days, before you made yourself known as a Jew and pro-Israeli, and when you were still embraced by the feminist movement. And I've always respected you. And Shoshana, I respect you immensely. And I'm so grateful to you for your intellect and for the fact that you always try to end on a positive note. Well, I'm going to begin this response in a positive note. The positive note is most staffers are quarantined. The only time any of them have to go in is if there's a vote, and the only votes are for appropriations for COVID-19. The good news is that because they're quarantined, they want to talk to me a lot. And so we're as busy as ever. We've had an average of 6 appointments a day with staffers about foreign policy issues. The bad news is we have great appointments, but their bosses only really want to hear about COVID-19. So and there have been a bunch of things that we're working on. One is a letter which has been sponsored by Jeff Strube about stopping this money that we're giving to the LAF, which directly goes into the hands of Hezbollah, directly or indirectly goes into the hands of Hezbollah, which is listed in the State Department as a terrorist organization, and it contravenes American law. Another issue that we have been working on forever is the pursuit of justice for American victims of Palestinian terrorism. There is a particularly heinous terrorist named Akram Tamimi who was responsible for the planning and was part of the execution of the Sparrow Pizzeria bombing on August 9th, 2001. She dropped off the suicide bomber. She picked out the Sparrow Pizzeria because she has said in a YouTube video that she was looking for a place that young Jewish families frequent, and it was very popular. She dropped off the bomber, she left, and unfortunately, Izzeddin al-Masri, the suicide bomber, was wearing a belt underneath his jacket and had a guitar case with screws and nuts and bolts. He calmly ate his pizza, detonated himself, and the blast was so horrific that ensued that it shook most of Western Jerusalem. It killed 15 innocent civilians, including 2 Americans, Malki Roth, who was 15 years old, and Judith Greenbaum, who was 31 years old and was pregnant at the time. And a 3rd American, Hannah Nachenberg, was comatized, and she lies in a vegetative state ever since. In 2011, I should first say she's confessed many, many times, and she was arrested by the Israeli police. And as you know, in 2011, many people demonstrated because Israel is an almost entire citizen army. Everybody has a brother, sister, father, mother that's in the army or has been through the army. And Gilad Shalit had been kidnapped and was hidden for many, many years. Prime Minister Netanyahu was under tremendous pressure. There were a lot of demonstrations. He caved. Hamas asked for 1,027 terrorists with blood on their hands. And that was a very, very dear price. They wouldn't accept petty criminals. And among those 1,027 terrorists was Akram Tamimi. Now, when she was released, she went to Jordan. They showered her with flowers, treated her like a conquering hero, and gave her her own television show. Hamas gave her her own television show. We had a series of hearings that we've requested and have had a lot of congressional letters. And by now, because of all of the pressure that Amet has put on various administrations, there has been an extradition request. There is a reward for $5 million. And Jordan signed an extradition treaty with the United States in 1995. And we have asked for 3 other terrorists, and they have extradited them, and they're serving out long prison sentences here in American penitentiaries. But now they suddenly claim that there is no extradition treaty between the United States and Jordan. So we have a letter going, and we've had quite a few, I think it's about a half a dozen people during this COVID-19 crisis who were staffers who managed to talk to their boss about it and got back to us. And they are going to sign on to this letter to Dina Kawar, who is the ambassador from Jordan to the United States. But I should say we're on that Jordan signed a peace treaty with Israel in 1994. And King Abdullah and before that, King Hussein had plenty of years to sow the societal groundwork towards peace with Israel, and they never had. Their textbooks are just as incendiary and anti-Semitic as any textbooks you could read anywhere. So, and there are some other things, SRES 509, which was introduced by Pat Toomey and Jackie Rosen, is a Senate resolution asking Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to extend the sanctions on Iran because UN Security Council Resolution 2231 is due to expire on October 18th of this year. So there are some other things before the COVID-19 pandemic and quarantine. There were about 20 people on the resolution. There's still about 20 people on the resolution. So it's very hard to get people's attention on certain things, but hopefully this will blow over and we can redirect their focus.
Thank you, Sarah. I know you're working very hard and appreciate all the work that you're doing through Amet. The final question before we get to, and I know we're running out of time, but we do want to take some of the questions of the listeners. But Phyllis, I wanted to close with you. As a psychologist and psychotherapist, can you share your thoughts on why it seems that Israelis, generally speaking, were so much more amenable to the quarantining and eradicating the Wuhan virus seemingly more enthusiastically than Americans? I mean, Israel really did a phenomenal job. I know we're starting to see some numbers increase there as everywhere in the world, but they really limited the spread quickly and thoroughly. And I know that you have, as a New Yorker, written about what you see life in New York like, but maybe you can talk to us about the difference in the way the two countries have been handling it.
I think that Israel finally understood psychologically that it's a matzav, it's a situation that needs to be contained. It's not going to go away anytime quickly. And so with enormous fortitude, Israelis have flourished despite all the hostilities and dangers on all of its borders at all times. I was privileged to be part of a webinar with someone from the Dudavon unit who described now being in charge of the emergency room in a hospital in the south of Israel for COVID. She was in charge of it. Everyone's yelling and screaming and dying and, carrying on. And she said, well, it was not different than being in Gaza or on the West Bank at different times when she was there. She's a doctor. And I thought, Israelis are a hardy people. And we in the West, in New York, in America, we aren't prepared for ongoing tragedy. We think things are going to come up roses and we're going to be okay. And we're refusing to believe that human history is filled with plagues that have laid cultures, countries low. We think we're going to be okay. It's an upward trend. But now we're going to have to grapple with not so fast, not so soon. So I think Israelis, and I think very often of them having to get to a bomb shelter in Sde Road in such a short period of time, and the trauma, the complex post-traumatic trauma that this involves, I think Israelis are doing very well. And I'm not so certain about the hardiness of Americans who I see walking in the streets of Manhattan without masks, too close to each other, unable to discipline themselves, unwilling to take good advice or to live with profound contradiction and doubt. So these are just scattered thoughts. By the way, thank you, Sarah, for those kind remarks. I want you to know that I was getting petitions for the resolution that Zionism equals racism in the mid-'70s. and I was exposing anti-Semitism among the left and among feminists back in 1971. You're correct though, I didn't become devoted to this as a 21st century, almost full-time occupation while doing feminist work. But thank you for remembering.
Thank you all. We do have some time for some questions, and I've gotten a number of them in, and I'm going to try to just, maybe we'll run through these pretty quickly. They run the gamut of the various topics we talked about. This first question, I think, is for Phyllis and Sarah, talking about the blood libels and the anti-Semitism from leftists and Muslims, and the indoctrination that results. This is from Larry Greenberg, who noted that they trade in narratives, we trade in facts. Don't narratives beat facts? How do we deal with this? And I'll, Phyllis, you're laughing. Why don't you take the lead, and then Sarah?
There's really nothing to laugh about. Once you have a paradigm, and the fix is in. Palestinians, for example, are not terrorists. They are innocent victims of the most malevolent Israeli aggression. Israelis are never defending themselves. No, because that's not allowed. Once you have a paradigm that the victim is pure and holy, and the oppressor is evil and must be shamed, humiliated, canceled, and eradicated, exterminated. Once you believe that way of thinking, and once it gets you published, once it gets you a professorship, once it gets you funding, and this is what's happening. I mean, look at Rashid Khalidi is the Edward Said chair, of course, at Columbia. I mean, those who know the lies he tells, wonderfully reviewed by Benny Morris in the Jewish Review of Books in the latest issue. Once you understand that people are indoctrinated, as a psychologist, I think, how are we going to work against brainwashing? Every textbook on prejudice and racism excludes Jew hatred or Judeophobia or anti-Semitism. So this is a huge draining of the swamps that we're involved in now. It's not a small thing, and we're always coming from behind. And this has been, I'd say, the day after. It began with Soviet Russia, okay, with propaganda against Israel. But the day after Israel won the war of self-defense in 1967, the propaganda was funded, and it has worked its evil these many years later. So people are lazy. They don't think independently. They don't want to lose popularity. They don't want to bear the burden. And I'm now thinking of American Jews too, who don't want to bear the heavy burden of sticking up for the truth and sticking up for Israel, one and the same thing. They would rather stick to the narrative and be safe and popular, right? So this is what we're up against.
I'm going to follow that up with a question, Sarah, before you chime in, because this is related, and it may be that you can tie these all together. How do we combat and expose the lies of anti-Israel Jewish groups such as JVP and the New Israel Fund? And all three of you should feel free, after Sarah speaks, to add your thoughts on that.
Okay, I also wanted to piggyback first a little bit on what Phyllis said. I was just a master's level psychologist. I was a school psychologist for many years, and there is this concept of cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance means, don't bother me with the facts. I have my mind made up, and anything that interferes with, this belief system is forbidden. Unfortunately, and Phyllis also spoke about the Academy, and in 1978, Edward Said wrote his book Orientalism, which basically revolutionized the teaching of Middle Eastern studies. And he said that anybody who wasn't a native of the land, i.e. an Arab, could not speak with any true authenticity about the region. And so therefore, wonderful, wonderful intellects and scholars like Ephraim Karsh and Bernard Lewis were, sent to the dustbin, and they started reading people like Rashid Khalidi and Joseph Mossad and, Khatam Bazian over at Berkeley. And what is so upsetting is that generations of people right now have been brainwashed, on this kind of disgusting, one-sided propaganda as a paltry substitute for a real solid education. And they have legions, unfortunately, of Jews who've also been influenced in the Jewish Voice for Peace and If Not Now When and J Street. It's upsetting. I've spoken to some of the parents who said, all the stuff that you taught us and that we learned in Hebrew school is wrong. You pay for us to go to these great schools. These are the experts. They know what they're talking about. So we have our work really, really set out for us. It is very difficult for anybody who is a Zionist or is even an American patriot to survive some of these postgraduate classes in any of the social sciences or humanities, but in particular in political science or Middle Eastern studies. And either they decide to lie and then they feel like a heel as they write their papers, or they just buy into it. So how to penetrate that, I don't know. I really wish we can. We also know about the billions of dollars that have been showered on universities by Qatar and by Saudi Arabia. And so you look at the number of doctoral dissertations that are written talking about the hypocrisy of any of these countries. They're nil, they're none, as opposed to how many are written about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so it's a very, very difficult question. I wish I knew the answer. I wish we could challenge them dollar for dollar, but we can't, and shower the universities with that kind of money. But we can't. We don't have the kind. Maybe the best thing about this coronavirus pandemic is that the price of oil is going all the way down. So hopefully that will hurt in some of their wonderful endowments to these universities. I don't know.
So it's 4:00 and I've gotten a number of questions. I'm going to try to combine a couple really quickly for you, Shoshana, that are foreign policy related, and we'll maybe close. So, Dr. Mark Meyerowitz, Shoshana has sent in a couple questions I'm going to combine. He noted that the Saudis proposed a ceasefire in Yemen. The Houthis said no. Does this mean that Saudi is weakening in its ability to challenge Houthis and their backer Iran? And he also asked, is there a way to forge a peaceful cooperative solution to share the resources of the Eastern Mediterranean and include all of the interested parties? And can there ever be a rapprochement of Greek and Turkish Cyprus, which could help to resolve the Eastern Mediterranean situation?
Thank you. On the first one, Saudi Arabia doesn't really have influence with the Houthis. The Houthis are not interested in Saudi Arabia. They are interested 100% in Iran, which funds them and arms them and takes care of them. And Iran wants a base in Houthi land, which would give them control of the Red Sea, which is a problem for Israel, for Jordan, for Saudi, for Egypt. So no, Saudi Arabia has no influence with the Houthis. I'm not sure how we influence those people. The Iranians seem to have them sewn up for the moment. But the run of Iranian foreign policy may change if things get worse there. On the question of the Eastern Mediterranean and energy, the outlier there is Turkey. Turkey has poor relations with Israel, poor relations with Cyprus and with Greece. And in fact, they just drew a line in the Eastern Med claiming that there's a border between Turkey and Libya. It's a water border between Turkey and Libya. And the whole point of it is to say that those countries on the eastern side, like Egypt and Israel and the Palestinian Authority, in fact, can't sell their gas, can't do their thing over that line without the permission of Turkey and Libya. It's a way to want to get in. Turkey should be in the consortium. Turkey has every reason to want to be in the consortium, but at the moment it's a spoiler for everybody. It's a spoiler for the Kurds, it's a spoiler for Syria, for Israel, for Crete, for Cyprus. It just doesn't play nicely with other people. If it could play nicely, Turkey would probably be in, and that would be a much better thing, but not yet.
Thanks, Shoshana. I'm going to ask one final question. I just saw Mindy Stein sent in a question about what's happening at the ICC, and I think that's a topic that's important to just, if someone can just really touch very briefly. I don't know if that's Shoshana, Sarah, if you want to just quickly, if you have any insight into what's going on there. Shoshana.
The ICC had a very limited mandate when it was constructed. And everybody who was opposed to it when it was constructed knew that it would never live inside its limited mandate. The United States is not a member. Russia's not a member. Israel's not a member. Mostly it was designed to take on countries that don't have an independent, because it violates American constitutional protections for American citizens. So we simply were not interested in such a thing. Israel obviously knew that it would be the brunt of, like the UN, it would end up in the same position. The United States will protect Israel from whatever happens at the ICC to the best of the United States' ability. I don't like it. Israel doesn't like it. America doesn't like it. I'm not sure what the ultimate disposition of claims there will be.
I just want to add to that unfortunately these institutions of universal jurisdiction have made themselves like the Supreme Court of the world. And we see these totalitarian regimes that, basically reign supreme there, and wonderful Western style democracies such as the United States and Israel are the brunt of that. I know that both the United States and Israel they're not a member, but not only that, but they're constantly condemned, and Israeli soldiers are at risk and traveling certain places because of these absurd canards that they wage against them, which they obviously don't apply to any other country, although they're beginning to take up the United States as well. So it's a disgusting kind of scorpion pit full of attacking beasts that really use a horrific double standard when judging both the United States and Israel.
And I'd like to add to what Sarah said. The first Syrians have just gone on trial for their war crimes in Syria. They are not on trial in the International Criminal Court. They are on trial in Germany because the ICC will not take up the issue of war crimes in Syria. They have time for Israel. They do not have time for Syria, where 500,000 or more people, 600, whatever, were killed in Syria, and the ICC can't get it together to talk about them. The Germans are doing it.
So on that note, I want to thank you all. We've sort of run out of time, and I think we could go on all afternoon. My esteemed panelists, Shoshana, Phyllis, Sarah, who did an amazing job of covering very complicated subjects in such a brief time period, which was not an easy task. You all were phenomenal. I'm sure that everybody that was watching agrees with me that these women are brilliant assets, and we are blessed to have them researching, writing, speaking, and educating all of us about how to survive in this very complicated world of turmoil, enemies, and strife. All of their work could use your support, and I encourage everybody watching to visit their websites that I shared at the beginning of the conference and to donate to their organizations and just support them and their work. Share their materials with friends, family, and get the names of the Jewish Policy Center, Phyllis Chesler Organization, and the Endowment for Middle East Truth out there, please. Thank you all for joining, and we look forward to doing a future, as I said, this is going to be the beginning of a series of webinars with brilliant women, and I look forward to doing another one with you all soon. Thank you all again.